Bray, the Executive Director and CEO of USA for UNHCR. I hope you are safe and well. USA for UNHCR has used the power of photography to share stories of the forcibly displaced around the world. Today, we are pleased to introduce you to two photographers behind the lens and hear their personal perspectives on the power of photography in helping to tell and amplify refugee stories. We'll see images of people in urgent refugee situations, as well as people who have found home here in the United States. As you take in their work and hear their perspectives, I hope you take a moment to think, to act, to feel, and to soak in the lives of refugees. I'm joined today by two very special guests, Lucian Perkins and Sebastian Rich. Lucian is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning and former staff photographer at the Washington Post. He's covered conflict around the world, and more recently, his work focuses on resettled refugees communities right here in the United States. Sebastian is a long-time war and humanitarian photographer who's worked countless times with UNICEF and UNHCR and several other humanitarian organizations capturing refugee crises around the world. I want to thank you both for taking time with us today. I know we have donors, supporters, and compassionate Americans from every corner of the country participating in today's event. I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking you for caring for the well-being of refugees and for participating in this event to recognize their strength and resilience. For many people around the world, every day has been transformed in ways we never imagined 4 months ago. But wars and persecution have not stopped. Globally, there are nearly 80 million refugees, displaced people, and asylum seekers. It's important that we recognize and consider that there are individual people behind that vast number. And while we wish we could share each and every refugee story with you, we are proud to share a few today through the unique power of photography with Lucian and Sebastian to celebrate their lives. Thank you all for forwarding questions. We've taken the questions into account as we form today's program. So let's get started. One of the most important elements of USA for UNHCR's work is how we uplift and share the stories of refugees from around the world. Through this storytelling, we hope people recognize the gravity and scale of forced displacement and the importance of our mandate. People care, they realize what we have in common with people forced to flee and show compassion. That people act, donate, or influence others to make a difference for the forcibly displaced. Photography is so central to this work. It helps us communicate both the plight and hope and dignity of vulnerable people around the world. Sebastian, I'll start with you. Many of the images you've captured working with UNHCR have been of families fleeing for their lives or in the relative safety of a refugee camp. Can you share some of what you've seen on the ground and why capturing these images is meaningful for you?
Well, first of all, that figure you gave of 80 million, what I'd like people to also take into account that half of those are children, tiny little children caught up in that with no understanding of what's going on at all. What do I capture in a war zone or a refugee camp? Okay, let's say it's in a refugee camp where refugees have come for the first time. They're bewildered. I try and capture that bewilderment, that sense of loss at the beginning. And then somehow I try and photograph, as the days and the weeks progress, a sense of hope. But one of the things that I do try and get across in my images now is the one thing that war cannot take away from these people, and that is dignity.
Yes.
They've lost everything, but they keep their dignity. And one of the little things that I do now, especially with women who are refugees, is that when I go into their tent or their shelter, I don't immediately start clicking away. I always say to the woman, how would you like to be photographed?
Mm-hmm.
And they've always managed to take with them a tiny, tiny little bit of makeup or something. And they go into the back of the tent and they come out with how they think they're looking best. And that somehow uplifts a moment that is very sad. But it's for me, its dignity, but also at the same time in my work, trying to show the need, what they need, what the donors need to get to the camps and for specifically.
I really understand what you mean by the dignity, and then the subjects being able, the people that you're photographing, being able to have some decision and inclusion in how they want to be portrayed is so important.
Absolutely, because the word refugee, for some unknown reason in recent times, has become the word translates into terrorist or not a good person. And if I throw my objectivity out of the window, which I can't help but do sometimes in those situations, my mission is to actually get across to people, general public, world leaders, that these are people just like you and I. The only difference between you and I and these, they've had everything stripped away from them in an instant, a fraction of a second. How would we feel? And how would we feel if we were suddenly called a terrorist or an unwanted person?
So it's that empathy, that connection, what we have in common rather than just the differences.
Oh, absolutely. We're all the same. I mean, for instance, Syrian refugees, people seem to have, and still have, the perception that refugees are somehow poor people who lived off the land, and it's, they're ignorant and uneducated. Syrian refugees, I have interviewed and spoken to lawyers, policemen, judges, politicians, dentists, all walks of life, professional walks of life. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but people seem to forget that it's people like that who are also refugees.
Yeah, thank you. Lucian, most of our work with you has been focused on resettled refugees living in the United States. Now, some people might consider resettlement to being the end of a journey. What have your experiences told you about that?
Well, first, let me jump on a little bit what Jermaine said. I spent almost 30 years photographing refugees around the world. And I think what's exciting about what I'm doing now is I'm seeing the results of what can happen if refugees find a place, find a home. So many of the refugees that I had photographed in places like Afghanistan or former Yugoslavia, I had no idea what happened to them.
Right.
What moves me about what I've been doing over the last 2 years for the USA for UNHCR is finding refugees that have the opportunity for a new life. And you're right, it's just the beginning in terms of they're all of a sudden put into a new country. I'm thinking of one refugee from Africa who moved to North Dakota. I mean, that's where he lived and had never experienced snow or cold before. So they're thrown into entirely new cultures. But what's amazing is their excitement to embrace this new world. And that's one of the things that I've been able to experience is them embracing a new life and a new life for their children, which is the first and foremost on most of their minds.
Lucian, like when you're planning a photographic session with resettled refugees, what are the challenges or sensitivities that you have experienced or need to prepare for?
Well, I think in this situation, it's a little different because, as opposed to being in refugee camps, because most of the refugees that we've photographed here in the United States are excited about their new life, their new opportunity, and they want to share their story. So I think it's more just being culturally sensitive to their way of life, which in some respects is different, but the same as ours. But it's all about the fact that they're going to treat you with hospitality, which all refugees that I've met have, and it's being hospitable to them and welcoming to them, which obviously I am. But it's, as I said, it's a bit different because I think in most cases, they want to tell their story and they're ready to begin a new journey.
Yeah, I mean, we're very committed at USA for UNHCR, not in just telling refugee stories, but in ensuring that we provide the platforms by which refugees can tell their own stories. So I really appreciate that. And I've got to take up the comment of hospitality. It doesn't matter if I'm in a refugee settlement in an urban city in Africa, or I'm in a refugee camp. Every time I meet with refugees and their families, they roll out the hospitality. It is just such a part of their culture. So great observations, and thank you for that. Sebastian, one of the most important guidelines that we live by at USA for UNHCR is ensuring that the stories of refugees and the displaced people that we work with are shared with dignity and respect. And we talked a little bit about that earlier. We aim to inspire empathy rather than pity. What's your take on that? And how do you take that into account when you're in the field?
Well, yeah, empathy, all important. Sympathy and pity, no, out of the window. It's
right.
Useless. It serves no purpose, right? You, as a photographer in that situation where I'm very often at a UNHCR registration point where refugees come in on their very, very first day, and they are frightened. They're in a big long line. The children are screaming and so forth. And I do take pictures, but at the same time, you don't become over passionate where it gets in the way of what you're there to do, because I have a job to do, but I'm also a father and I'm also a human being, just like the refugees lining up to register. So I take the pictures, and if the kids are crying, you take time, you play with them, you talk. Doesn't matter what the language is, whatever. So it's just for me in those moments, in those people's moments of quintessential fear, it's the worst part. It's the second worst part of their life. The first part was being barrel bombed, in Syria. The second part is signing that bit of paper and becoming a refugee. So for me, it's compassion, and it's just being a nice person while you're getting on with your job.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also another stage. You talked about being in the registration centers, which is often the first point of entry for a refugee into the processing documentation. There is something else that I've experienced, is kind of the ennui, the boredom that can come for refugees. And you particularly see this in young men and men who have been very in control of their lives. And I can remember being in Azraq and speaking with a family, and they were just begging for a volunteer opportunity, something that made their lives a little bit more interesting, because often there isn't the right to work. There are very few activities within a camp, depends on the country, that they can participate in. I'm thinking of Azraq in particular. And that's a different story. And I have found sometimes with Syrian refugees, it's very difficult to get the men to open up. But it doesn't matter if I'm in a camp in Jordan or if I'm in Kakuma, there is a desire to have control over your own future. These are not people looking for handouts. They're looking to be self-sufficient again. Is that something that you've seen in your work, Sebastian or Lucian, when you've been in the field?
I've seen it so many times, because initially there's a whole frantic movement going on in registration, getting your NFIs, non-food items and so forth. And then you settle down into your shelter, whatever it is. And then the boredom sets in.
Yeah.
Right? And then the man who's, been the provider feels that he's been, his role has been taken away as the provider, because he's now reliant on UNHCR or whoever it is to provide for him and his family, right? So it is very, very difficult when the boredom sets in. And one of the other things is that a photographer, and this goes to any photographer who starts on this path of working with you guys or UNICEF or any other NGO, is when you go into that shelter, those people have been bored for so long. You are the only show in town, and especially with the kids.
Yes.
And you have to remember that. This is a big thing. You're just there. You're going from tent to tent, story to story. But those kids, especially the kids, you are the entertainment. and just remember it and be the entertainment.
Yes, yeah.
I
And it's
want to jump.
Yeah, Lucian.
I want to
please,
jump on what Sebastian said earlier. Is when I first went to a refugee camp, you just see a mass of people and you're very overwhelmed. And once you start talking to people, you realize, as Sebastian said, these are teachers, lawyers, doctors. These are people, many of them highly motivated, led very productive lives. And all of a sudden, their whole world is turned upside down. And, perhaps with the pandemic happening here in the US, I think people can understand that a little better, how quickly your life can change. And it's hard for us to visualize that. But in the case of people that I've met in the refugee camps, they literally one night were at home eating a meal, and the next day they're thrown out in the streets and forced to cross a border into another country. And what happens is they end up spending many times years in refugee camps with absolutely nothing to do and trying to find some way to restore the dignity that they had lost. It's a very difficult thing to watch and see.
And it's interesting, Lucian, I mean, given your focus on resettled refugees here in the US, and when I travel to camps, all I have consistently heard from refugees is their desire to go home, even if that is not possible. It's not necessarily resettlement somewhere else. They all aspire to go home. And I think we've seen that particularly in the Syrian crisis. People are waiting and they want to stay in the region where they can, because they still largely, for the most part, have family or property back in Syria. And that's it's a different thing. And I think people may not realize that for most refugees, all they aspire to do is go home. And so few of them actually will return home. It's more about finding a home or settling in a host country, or eventually making their way to the US or to other countries. I want to thank you both for your comments. Many thousands of people see the journey of refugees through your eyes and your lens. Most people immediately understand an image. And so the medium is incredibly valued to an organization like ours that's trying to convey the scale, but also the humanity behind the refugee crises to people who aren't necessarily witnessing it firsthand. We express sincere appreciation for the hard work of all photojournalists and photographers who work for humanity, often risking their lives for the sake of the calling to tell the story. I'd like to shift this a little bit and talk a little bit about images that are important to you, or photographs that you are particularly connected with. In advance of this event, we asked you both to select some of your favorite photographs. And before we dive into that, I'd love to hear what you think makes a good photograph. What characteristics make a photograph more effective in inspiring viewers to take an action or to feel a particular emotion? Sebastian.
Oh, sorry. I was hoping Lucian was going to answer first. Having to make something up in my head.
Oh, you're up.
what a question, Lucian. What makes a good picture? In humanitarian terms, it depends. If you're trying to show the need, what is needed, is water needed, are shelters needed, and so forth. But it's trying. Lucian will agree with me. It's very easy to walk around a refugee camp and get pictures of people living in crap and living in squalor and so forth, and it being miserable. I like to try and somehow combine the need and the hope that the people have of things will get better. So your children collecting water, they're laughing and joking, walking from a water tank, say, they're splashing and playing with water as children do. That shows the hope and the happiness of children, but it also shows the need that you need piped in water, not water in tanks. So it's a combination of the need and the hope for me. Great.
Lucian.
The great thing about photography is that it literally freezes a moment in time. And that moment, for me, captures some emotion that we all identify with. regardless of what language we speak. We see hope, we see love, we see fear, we see passion. Every emotion that we all have, all of us, regardless of what culture we're from, what religion we're from, what language we speak, we understand those emotions that are frozen in a photograph. And that's, literally, that's what to me is wonderful about photography. And as a photographer, that's what I'm hoping to do, is convey something about that person I'm photographing that we all appreciate and understand, and can empathize with.
Thank you. I think there's something in both. I mean, both of you are two of my favorite photographers, but I think there's something unexpected as well that you both have captured. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about it now. Lucian, we're going to start with one of your favorite people. Would you like to take us through, I think we're just waiting for that image to come up. And this is Jermaine from Phoenix, Arizona. Why don't you talk us through a little bit about Jermaine, his story, and this photograph?
Well, Jermaine is from Togo, Africa. And when you first meet him, you would have no idea what he went through to get to America. And his vibrance, just his love for being in America, if you watch the video that we put together, is really inspiring. And in my mind, he's a truly inspirational person who not only inspired me, but inspired everybody that he's around in Phoenix, including, in this case, he now works for the Phoenix Police Department. Mm-hmm. And when we talked to his boss, for example, he had nothing but praise for Jermaine, because Jermaine was that person who could go out and talk to anybody. He was that person that could go out and calm any high pressured situation that they came across, just through his body language and, frankly, his ability to speak 7 languages. Yeah. He had a lot. There's a lot that he had going through it, partially, I think, from his own experience. He's from Togo, Africa. Out of nowhere, his village was attacked numerous times. His father was taken away and disappeared. People around him were killed, and they fled across the border and ended up in a refugee camp. I think somewhere around 14 years, going back to what Sebastian was talking about. What do you do during that 14 years that you're in a refugee camp? And, this is a good time to bring up that the average stay for somebody in a refugee camp is, as I understand it, 18 years before they can come to the United States. It's a long time. In his case, he used that time wisely. He went to school. He learned as much as he could. And I think one of the most heart-rending stories he tells us is when one day the UNHCR puts out a list every month or so with names of people that have been accepted to go to a new country. And he and his family saw their name on the list. And of course, they broke down and cried. And he looked around and there were people all around him crying. Not crying because they got in, but because once again, they did not get in. And one of the things that he carries with him to this day is the haunting memories of all the people still in that refugee camp that he got out. Just very briefly from there, he came to America. He worked in a meat processing plant. He went to school. He got educated.
College. Yeah.
Put himself through college. He joined the army, served in Afghanistan, now has, I think, 4 beautiful kids, and is a well-respected police officer in Phoenix.
Yeah. It's interesting because you talked about, restarting, and for him, there's fleeing Togo, and that's one restart. There's then finding out he's coming to the United States, another restart of his life. And I think his own quote is, he loves being an American. I love that. A refugee is a person who's lost everything, has no hope. A refugee is a person who's looking for a second chance. For me, being an American is a big deal. Living here is a blessing. And we ran this story on Veterans Day last year. And what I love about the photograph of Jermaine is, of course, he's got this big, huge, confident smile, but there is something unexpected about seeing a resettled refugee in a police uniform. This isn't how most Americans think about refugees. Here we see Jermaine in his uniform, fully integrated into his community. He's contributing his experience and skills to making Phoenix a safer city. And there's confidence there.
Well, and it points to, and look, I'm somebody that has the opportunity to see this because I've traveled all around the country doing stories on refugees like Jermaine. But what's so amazing is what they bring to this country. And that's what I think most Americans don't realize, is that these people are making this country better. And Jermaine's a very good example of that.
Yeah. And I think for us, this is a story that was picked up by the Fraternal Order of the Police and shared. It was picked up by veterans associations and shared. We know that this is a story that really resonated with the American public. It was our top performing story in 2018. And I think it really succeeded because his story is engaging and it engages a wide spectrum of values. It surprised our audiences with the unexpected, and it really was a very, very successful campaign for us.
I have to say, when I finished the video and looked at it, I just went, wow.
Yeah.
And part of it is, Jermaine starts out and he says, for me to be an American is a big deal. And he says it with such passion that you can't let go of it.
Yeah. It's a beautiful photograph and a wonderful video. Sebastian, let's look at one of your favorite images. Tell us a little bit about what you captured here.
It is one of my all-time favorite pictures. It's on the Afghan-Pakistan border. Now, those two little, a funny little thing about that picture first, because, and Lucian will know this, sometimes you get so involved in looking through the camera at certain aspects of the picture. And it wasn't until I'd taken the third or fourth frame that I'd noticed that there was a tiny little baby hanging in a hammock underneath the bumper. It was beautiful. But
and sometimes you don't discover it until after you look at the photograph.
Exactly. And I didn't. I'd done my bit there and just looked at the camera. I thought, oh my goodness, there's a baby there. But no, these two little girls were waiting with their mother and father and some other members of the family to repatriate back from Pakistan into Afghanistan. Now, these little girls had never seen it. They were born in Pakistan from their Afghan mother and father. And as you say, all refugees, all they want to do is to go home. Now, mum and dad were going to go home. And at that time, I think that picture was taken about 2 years ago, maybe two and a half years ago. The war is still raging in Afghanistan. Not all over, but in pockets. And it certainly was where they were going to go. And they were going to have a hard time getting there. But to them, it was more important to get home and get their children to know the country that they didn't know. So the children were happy to go because they just heard the stories from their parents. And they were happy to go. But mum and dad, even though they wanted to go, they were filled with trepidation on what the journey was going to behold for them. So yeah, it was a mirror with two sides, if you like. The children were very, very happy, but the parents were more than a little nervous, but they were still going to go ahead with it.
This is a time when Pakistan was really pushing to move a
Yeah,
refugee
I mean,
back into
Pakistan,
Afghanistan, perhaps a little bit
yeah,
in advance of the enthusiasm the refugees may have had for returning.
yeah, I mean, because as you well know, Pakistan hosts just about 90% of refugees from Afghanistan. Iran has a huge amount as well.
Huge number as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was a point in the Pakistani government just had enough, and unfortunately, there was a lot of brutality from local police and so forth. And a lot of people thought, well, I'd actually like to go home now. And so, but there were hundreds of people on that day going to cross the border back into Afghanistan and to go home. But the picture for me was just, it had all the elements of hope, color.
Yes.
It said a lot about the Afghan identity as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is something that really strikes me about the use of color and the composition here. It's just it's a brilliant photograph that brings our eye immediately into these charming, happy girls.
Yeah.
And I think it also kind of reinforces something that I know you've seen in your work with UNICEF as well as UNHCR and Save the Children. I've worked for all three organizations as well as, the resilience of children, that they can be in the hardest of circumstances, but they're still children. And that's something we can all relate to. And there is really something about the hopeful vibrance of these children, but it also communicates that after devastation, refugees can find some spark of joy. And there is a resilience there.
I've always been surprised at children not just in refugee camps, but actually in a fighting war, where the bombs, the bullets are actually falling around us, and the ability for the children still to smile, still want to play games with this strange big white guy with a camera around his neck, and all hell is breaking loose around them, and their resilience. And it's something we can all learn from these children, is how to cope. I mean, not all the time. I've seen the horror and in their eyes. I mean, one of the on the flip side of that coin is that someone asked me this question the other day about how do I deal with children in an active war zone, and with great difficulty, because the mother and father, they have some concept of what is going on, if it's religious, if it's ethnic cleansing, or it's political, whatever, and they know what these bangs and these whizzes mean, and the changing of air pressure, the juddering of the walls. The child has no idea what is going on. And when you look into that child's eyes with the confusion, it breaks your heart. It really does. And you just think, my goodness, will we ever not go to war? It's devastating. For me, it's devastating.
Yeah. At the top of our event, you mentioned the vast number of, the majority of refugees are children. Equally, women and children, and when we look at the Syrian crisis, make up 84% of the refugees are those that are forced to flee. It's particularly devastating for women and children, and it's a good reminder. But even with those kinds of statistics, the ability to capture a photograph like that is really quite special. It is a beautiful photograph.
One of the reasons I love the photograph so much is that I have lots of photographs of very, very unhappy, wounded, and sometimes dead children. Yeah. So that photograph, on a very personal level, it cheers me up. It's on the front page of my website at the moment, and it's on the homepage of my computer, because I like to open up my computer in the morning and be blasted with that color and all those smiles.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Lucian, let me kick it back to you. We're going to bring up another photograph that you've selected. This is Fatima, who lives in your hometown of Austin, Texas.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here?
Fatima, she came to the U.S. at 14 years old from Afghanistan. And think about that for a second, a teenager coming to a new country and not speaking the language. We were talking to her when we first met her, and the only words that she knew. She knew 3 words, and I can't remember 2 of them, but one of them was umbrella. And she goes, I don't know why I knew these American words, but this is all I knew.
Pumpkin.
Pumpkin and umbrella. She just, was so excited, just remembered, the possibility of coming to see what those 2 words meant, and of course many more. She's here with a group called Girl Forward, an organization in Austin, Texas. I think they're based in Chicago, that helps young women, girl refugees, mostly in their teens, acclimate and into American society. And of course, for a girl from Afghanistan, from anywhere, frankly, to acclimate to American culture is pretty difficult. And I think what's fascinating to me was here she's 18 years old, so this is 4 years later from her arrival. And she's a powerhouse. She's helping not only other refugee girls as they acclimate, but she's helping her classmates in school. She's well known for knowing every bus driver in Austin, Texas, and takes these new refugees around the city and teaches them how to get around the city just on buses. And of course, Austin is not a city known for getting around, except for if you have your own car. But
right.
she knows how to navigate it, and she's learned to navigate it. I didn't take this photograph, but I thought it was important to show. One of the most exciting moments in her life was graduating from high school, and she's now going on to college. And she told us that she's the first family member to go on to college, which she's not only very proud about, but feels it's an important obligation she has to go through it. And there's 2 exciting things about doing this story. One is I went to school in Austin, Texas, at the University of Texas at Austin. So it was great to be back, and it's great to see so many programs that Austin is doing to work with refugees, Girl Forward being one of them. And the other one is I've spent a fair amount of time in Afghanistan, especially in 2001. And it's a country that I really love. It's a beautiful country. The people are amazing. And to witness her coming from Afghanistan, war-torn Afghanistan, her father helped the U.S. military during the war, and as a result, their family was hunted down and they had to leave. So that's how they ended up here. One of her teachers said about Fatima, she said she's going to go somewhere, and I believe it. One of the things she kept talking to us about was her excitement about Mars and about maybe one day going to Mars herself. And she was very, very serious. So someday we may actually witness that.
You can tell, I think, from this photograph, you could really see the hope and promise of resettlement. She is active. She is engaged. It's all conveyed in this photograph. It's fabulous.
And I have to say, she's only been there for 4 years, and her English was pretty good. I was impressed.
Well, if she's on her way to college, that's, I can't imagine this was an easy transition for her. This would have been incredibly hard.
No, and she talks about, especially the first year, how painful it was. So many memories of the teacher asking her, how old you are. And she has no idea what they're saying, and all the kids are looking at her. And she has so many painful moments of the early days of being in school and not understanding anything. And she recovered very well from that.
Yes.
And as I said, more importantly, is helping younger girls that are just coming in to acclimate to all of that.
It's already paying it forward.
Exactly.
Contributing to a community. And, that's fantastic. Sebastian, I think we have another photograph that you've chosen to share with us that we're going to bring up now.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't
that great?
Talk to us. Yes. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, another one. Yeah, I mean, just beautiful. It was Syrian refugees in a UNHCR camp in northern Iraq. Yeah. And it's grandmother and granddaughter. The grandmother on the right, I was in the tent and we were on our own initially with myself and the translator talking about how they got here, the story on how they got there, which was terrifying, but not unusual, unfortunately. And as we were talking, her granddaughter ran in just to get something or whatever it was. But as she was getting whatever it was, I can't remember, she just suddenly turned around and grabbed her grandma and kissed her and hugged her and just told her how much she loved her grandma. And we vanished, we just sat there, and I just happily just took these pictures as it was grandma and granddaughter having a grand old time. And the picture for me, it hopefully shows that refugees, once again, and I keep repeating the same thing, they are the same as you and I. We have grandparents, we have grandchildren, and we love them dearly, and that never changes, and it will never go away. So for me, even though they were in that particular camp is not a very nice place, and they had a really bad story to tell. They'd lost a couple of family members on the way there, but they still had each other, and my goodness, they had each other. It was just, and it wasn't for the camera, it was just for them. I just happened to be the fly on the wall, and I was very excited taking those pictures.
Yeah, there is a joy and there's a purity and to the emotion. You can tell this isn't staged. It's just wonderful. And I think, who can't, as you said, everyone that's ever experienced a grandmother's love or the love of a grandchild is going to connect with this photo.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And also, in a more serious moment, I knew that grandma would fight tooth and nail to protect her granddaughter. It was something that we all recognize. That taking that picture in that day after photographing and documenting and getting content, for you guys, that was the highlight of my day, because the rest of it had been one very sad story after another. And this was a sad story, but it had this beautiful, it was the last bit of content gathering of the day. And it was, myself and the UNHCR staff that I was with, we got back in our nice, comfortable white car and had a smile on our face, it was good. It was good. And, and also I showed these guys the picture on the back of my camera, and they giggled like hell and laughed. And, the grandma was saying something like, "Oh my God, do I look like old?" And, "And no, grandma, you don't look that old. You look fabulous," which was very normal conversations, which was a normal conversation in a not so nice place.
We talked about the disproportionate number of children and women. And you two have both been privy in your work to see sometimes the plight, and it is the plight of the elderly refugee. I was just in Cox's Bazar, and there is a large number of elderly, and the situation and the services for the elderly refugees it's thin on the ground at the best of times.
Best of times, yeah.
Yeah, but you have somehow managed to capture a real dignity in these two, and a real kind of a real honest, pure joy, which is just fabulous.
Yeah, it's like as a photographer and photojournalist, those little diamonds fall into your lens every now and again, and I'm glad of it, because it reminds me, because some of us can get, if you go from camp to camp, war to war, you can get not so much jaded, but you can get, oh yeah, okay, another horror story. But when something like this comes out of a horror story, and it fills you up with hope again, and you can carry on to the next day of
I think that's kind of that unexpected element that I was talking about in both of your work, is that we have a preconceived idea of what a refugee is or a resettled refugee and how we expect to see them. And you have both, really found gems in that you've found a way to portray your subjects in a way that gives us the unexpected.
As I said before, it's too easy, and Lucian will know, he's spent a lot of time in camps as well.
Yeah.
And it's too easy to show horror and sadness and so forth. And yes, it is a horrible and a very sad place, but there is hope. And it's our job to see that hope and to show people that there is hope. It's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah.
And Sebastian's photograph points to, an important reason why older, one of the questions people sometimes ask me is, why bring older refugees to America? Well, these families rely on these older people, especially the young kids, as you can see in Sebastian's photograph. And probably nothing is more difficult than for them to come to another country where it's even harder, being older, to learn a new language. But they provide so much to family support, to the larger family, for that younger generation to get out and start a new life in America. They play a very important role in that.
I've had so many resettled refugees that are parents say they're not really doing this move or the resettlement to the US to benefit for themselves, but it's really about the future for their children. It's difficult for them, often depending on age, to assimilate in entirely, but they expect, and they do this for a better future for their children, better education, better employment opportunities. And then many cultures have a different attitude towards the elderly and the seniors, and really venerate, and they wouldn't contemplate moving without the full family if they can do it. And that makes sense in this case. These are, the work we do is with the most vulnerable people, and it's often the most vulnerable that are resettled to the US. We do have some additional questions that have come in from in advance of our conversation today. So I'd like to put a question to you first, Sebastian, and then I'm going to bring it back to you, Lucian. Given that you so often, and I think you've just started to hit on this, Sebastian, given that you so often cover the inhumanity that we are capable of, mankind, that is, how do you find light in the darkness? What keeps you at this work?
Wow. Very simply, children. Children, they are our only hope. The education of children. Children are not born with hate. None of us are, right? It's their environment that they're in. So my light at the end of the tunnel, and I do need it sometimes because I've been doing this a long time, and there have been many occasions where a story has affected me deeply personally. But I always seem to look at a child and think, maybe that's the future, that's the hope. That's certainly the light at the end of my tunnel, if I need that.
Thank you. Lucian.
It's funny, I was just thinking when you asked that question, of being in Kosovo and just the horror of what was happening, where tens of thousands of refugees are being pushed across the border. And one of the things that really moved me was all these young people from the UNHCR helping these refugees. One thing that happens over and over again is, in these horrible situations, you always find these people doing amazing things to either save people's lives, to save their families. You see these acts of heroism everywhere, and that's what keeps me going, is seeing people willing to step up and doing something to save whatever the situation is. And it could be very grim, but they're going to step forward and either save people or try to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And you always see that in these situations, these glimmers of hope, of people that want to make this a better world. And that's frankly what keeps me going. And look, for me to be able to, in some ways, come full circle and see refugees coming to this country and making this country a better world, a better place, is very inspiring for me as well.
Yeah, I think we have the opportunity in this line of work, and I work it from a different side than you do, but I think we've seen the very worst of humanity, and we've also seen those glimmers where we've seen the very, very best. And thank you for mentioning the UNHCR field workers, those that work in the sector. It is really quite amazing work. People say, how do you do that over and over? And I'm like, you have to do something. This is what we've been chosen to do. And I thank you for that. Would you say, Lucian, that your time as a photographer has made you more optimistic or pessimistic over time?
A mix of both. Sometimes I feel like we're putting our finger in a dam, trying to stop the big flood from coming. But that's not bad. I mean, I think, I see enough good things happening. At the same time, it seems like there's one tragedy after the next that continues afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we just have to keep fighting and put more fingers in that dam, and someday we'll make progress. I think the most important thing is I've certainly met enough people that have been influenced by not only my photographs, but other people's photographs, to go out and do something and to use their lives to make this a better world. And going back to what Sebastian is saying, I'm putting a lot of faith in our young generation, because I think that so many of them seem like they're willing to step forward and do something more than the previous generations have. And I have a lot of faith in that. So
thank you. Sebastian, more optimistic, more pessimistic?
I think Lucian hit the nail on the head. It's a large chunk of both. I think I've been through the roller coaster of cynicism, optimism, pessimism, and now it's a mixture of both. But I can't give up hope, because if I give up hope, I'm not going to do this job anymore, because that's one of the reasons that I'm doing it. And one of the reasons I'm doing it, it may be a naive concept, is that some of the photographs I may take may change the mind of a politician. It may make a major donor stick their hands in their pockets a bit more, and so forth. But also, yeah, it's the future generations, and it's showing now with the protests across the world, in America, England, everywhere, with with Black Lives Matter.
Right.
And 90% are young people who've never voted before as well. So it's that generation who are taking it by the reins, and they're seeing the change in the optimism.
Yeah, I've got to say, we do have our dark days in this line of work, but I am so inspired by our supporters who, despite what's going on in this country right now, despite COVID, are sending notes of encouragement and thanks for us continuing the work that we do. And we couldn't do that work without them. I'm so inspired by my staff, because this is truly, for everyone that works for us, it's a vocation. This isn't a job. I mean,
as if it wasn't difficult enough before, right?
People are passionate about finding the role they can play to make and shape a better world. And our job is to provide them with the tools and the tactics and the photographs, the video that will help them amplify the important work that we all do. I want to thank you both, Lucian and Sebastian. I sincerely appreciate your talent, your character, and your dedication to helping us protect refugees. Lucian, I haven't had the opportunity to meet you face to face. Sebastian and I keep crossing in different offices around the world, be it London or Washington, and hopefully soon in the field again.
Can I just say one thing about
yes,
the
absolutely.
UNHCR staff? I have a list of questions that I have when I sit down with a refugee family.
Yes.
It starts off a conversation and the rest is ad lib. And one of the questions I ask when we're sitting in the tent, I said, what would your life be like if UNHCR wasn't here? And the answer is always the same. We'd be dead.
Yeah.
So,
thank you
for the work.
That's a very good point, Sebastian, because I've come across the same thing. And I've seen it myself in some of these refugee camps out in the middle of nowhere. I think people underestimate, what the UNHCR does and has done. I knew that a long time ago working for the Washington Post, visiting these camps. Not to give a plug, but I sincerely believe that.
Well, and I'm going to give a plug to our supporters and our donors, because they're truly the ones that are enabling the difference that we're seeing. I mean, we could not do this without the supporters that are attending this event today. So I want to thank everyone for watching, for spending some of your time with us today in recognition of World Refugee Day, which is officially observed on June 20th, right after Juneteenth. It's times like this that it's so important that we look out for each other, and particularly the most vulnerable in our society. This is a time to show solidarity, to lift up and celebrate the voices and stories of refugees. They are indeed vulnerable, but they're also incredibly resilient and hopeful. So thank you for standing with us and with refugees at this critical time. Please stay home, stay safe, and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.